Welcome to session 3 of the Systems View on Life, the two modes. Today we are going to talk about the defining properties of life, about closing a system and how that increases predictability, what the consequences of that are. We are going to discuss topics like what is understanding, and we are going into the two modes of thinking that we have and link them to the defining properties of life. But first, we are going to talk about maintaining this equilibrium. And this actually goes into the question, what is life? Life is always different from its environment, because if it would not be different from its environment, it would be part of its environment, and a normal part of its environment, and it would be dead. So life has to maintain a difference from its environment, and it does this via agency. And agency is the ability to control the in and output of a system. So to be able to adapt how the system interacts with its environment, and that can lead to a boundary, here in the picture, a self-created boundary where created by the agent that creates an internal environment that is different from the external environment. And the internal environment of an agent, a living agent, is able to maintain itself. But it's only able to maintain itself when it has enough nutrients and things from its environment. So it needs stuff from its environment, and therefore it influences the environment. And the proper way to do that, to influence the environment, is to do it in such a way that the environment, although the agent takes from it, but net actually improves. And therefore, if you return to that environment at a later point in time, you have a higher quality environment. That would be the ideal. So key point is that a living agent is different from its environment through its own doing. And it is in this equilibrium as long as it is alive. The moment it is not able to maintain the disequilibrium, it dies. And there is a formal description for that associated with the concept of needful freedom. So we have needs, the needs to remain different from our environment, and we need energy to do that. And the energy is carried by materials, by food that goes in and waste that goes out. And we need to self-maintain ourselves via the flux of energy and materials through us. And that self-maintenance is through behavior, through our interactions with the world under our own control. So that is what behavior actually is. So then we have two kind of situations. We have a situation of a dying agent that is not able to maintain itself, and a non-dying agent, actually a thriving agent that is able to negotiate the world. And here it is in a good situation, but now it goes to a bad situation. It solves its problem and returns again to a good situation, and it remains there. So good situation is one with satisfied needs, and a bad situation with unsatisfied needs. If your needs are sufficiently long not satisfied, you can't maintain the material throughput and energy throughput you need in order to remain alive, and then you are dead. So that leads to the question of how to use your freedom. If you yourself are responsible for your own existence, then you have some freedom to take that responsibility and act that responsibility. And when you do it well, you keep on living. When you do it not well, you eventually disappear, you die. This is associated with the topic of understanding. We have different forms of understanding. So one very important form of understanding is understanding that the situation gets worse or gets better. And this has to do, of course, also with the activation of the coping mode and the co-creation mode. But simply knowing, okay, yeah, the situation is fine, or it is getting worse, so I have to activate myself, is a really, really important form of cognition. But there are more forms of understanding. So here you have a problem and you need to solve the problem, and therefore realize an intended result, which is the definition of power. And in order to come up with a solution, you need intelligence. Another form of understanding is learning how things work, associated with play, for example. When do you play in a situation that is safe and where you are not pressed by immediate needs, and then you fool around and you discover the possibilities of the world and therefore how things work. Another way of understanding is how to maintain and improve a good habitat, which is associated with wisdom, for example. And this gradually leads to an improvement of the habitat, and when you return to a previous situation, you will find that it's actually improved compared to the first time you were there. But we also need a form of understanding associated with problem solving, and especially if we are in a bad situation with not many fulfilled needs, in how to use whatever you still have as effectively as possible. So that is to protect and use whatever scarce resources you have. That is a form of understanding associated with conservation. It's a fallback, say, of the wisdom, but it's an important one. But this one might be associated with a coping trap, in which your solutions create new problems requiring new solutions, etc. So it's a mixed bag here. Important thing here is that all these things have to do with anticipating consequences. And in the case of the coping trap, you did not fully anticipate the consequences because you create new problems. But the moment you can do that well on long enough spatial and temporal scales, then you can eventually end up here again and hopefully remain here a lot. So with high understanding, high anticipation capabilities, you can remain here. So the next thing then is how to combine these forms of understanding. So we have the surviving and thriving with coping and co-creation as respectively the modes of being associated with that. But there is we can formulate this in a more abstract, more formal form in three components. First one is anticipation, which is associated when tendencies are distinguished and acted upon depending on whether the states will approach or recede from the boundary of viability. Well, like I said, understanding whether the situation gets worse or better. Coping is associated with if you see that the states go towards death, then you should be able to make them turn around and to let them go towards a better situation again. So that is coping. Co-creation doesn't have a real end state. It is trying to maintain a good situation, or to see the tendencies that go in this direction and gradually improve them more and more in the world. And so that you are easier and better able to do proactive need satisfaction, so to prevent pressing problems to occur. This is coping is associated with intelligence and clearly defined tasks with begin and end states, and wisdom is associated with continual improvement without specific end goals. And so we have seen that before. And this fits again in core cognition, and here I show only the core of core cognition, so to say, so not the other axis, where there is a clear direction. We want to go to the right, but on the vertical axis there is not a preference side. So we might think that intelligence is, because it's about problem solving and we all like intelligence, that it is always the best strategy. And intelligence also associated with asserting oneself in the environment. But asserting oneself means spending a lot of energy. You have to change the environment while the other strategy is not using your intelligence, is accepting the situation and adapting to it as much as possible. That still needs some measure of intelligence, but it's a different form of intelligence. And knowing when to assert yourself or when to adapt to the situation is a very important skill. And in many cases there are multiple solutions and work perfectly fine. You can solve your problem or you can adapt to the situation. The important thing is that we want to avoid this side. So that is the only direction that we want to avoid problems and a survival situation. That doesn't mean that we will always avoid them, but we tend to avoid. Well, and all life then has a path through this world. We sometimes are on the positive side, sometimes we have problems, sometimes we accept the situation, sometimes we assert ourselves. So let's now go into different depictions of agency, and that is more a graphical thing. So here is the full complex picture of an agent in a complex environment. And the key, of course, is that the agent is able to maintain itself via its control over its interface with the environment. And this is visualized here in somewhat more concisely and more simple. Here we have the agency, which is the relationship with the external world. So the external world is now on the outside. The agent and the external world are separated. Now, of course, the agent is embedded. And the world offers so-called affordances. And what are affordances? It's basically action possibilities. And the agent has to discover these action possibilities via play or other ways. And action possibilities give the agent options. And the agent then has to select from all the options what it wants or needs to do, but it has to do so in a way that optimizes its viability and it maintains its viability. And so the question for the agent is always, is my viability improving or degrading? But at a certain moment it selects a course of action, a behavior, and it interacts with the world. And now it can take from the world whatever it needs, but eventually that doesn't work, because then the environment degrades and the environment will no longer provide whatever the agent needs. So the agent is also co-responsible for a high quality and a sustainable environment or habitat. So the same question arises here. Is the habitat improving or degrading? So let's couple that with the definition of agency. That was from Bariandan and Di Paolo. An agent is an autonomous organization that adaptively regulates its coupling with its environment and contributes to sustaining itself as a consequence. So this is here the key, but the key is associated with the options, the selection, whether it increases own viability of environmental viability. Here I have made another picture that is even more abstract and goes even more to the core. So now the key point is to maintain agent viability, but also habitat viability, and constantly thinking whether is my situation or that of the environment improving or degrading. When your own situation is problematic, then you typically go into a coping mode in which you protect your own viability. When the situation is fairly okay enough for you, you can contribute to the environment and environmental quality via co-creation strategies. So that means that life is about, well, avoiding death and co-creating a high viability environment or habitat. And it must do so by balancing, asserting yourself, which is energy intensive, or adapting to the situation, which is much more energy efficient. And if you look at this process, this is a process in which the complexity of behavior selection is an important issue. Some it's high and some it is low. And the affordance content is also an issue. Sometimes you have many options and sometimes you have only few options. So that can all be connected to the full picture of core cognition. And now this, for the first time, it is kind of derived from first principles. So we have a situation in which we always try to optimize our own viability. So we always try to go in this direction and we try to avoid this. But life throws all kinds of things at us, so it is difficult enough. Then we can assert ourselves or we can adapt to the situation. This is the axis of complexity of behavior selection. So in a low complexity environment, you don't have to assert yourself. It is good, it's pleasant, it's viable. So you don't really have to do anything. But you can, of course, completely freely contribute to the quality of the environment. In this is a high complexity environment. You have few options. Most of the options are actually leading to death or even more dangerous situations. So you have to make the proper decisions in order to end up here again. On this axis, you have here many options, or you are in a situation where you can, in theory, discover those options. And how do you discover the options, the affordance content of the world? Via play. And then you learn the opportunities of the world. And here you have very few options and you have to be very, very careful not to do the wrong things. So this is kind of the picture of core cognition that is now derived from the core properties of life and hence a core property of all of life. And it is also the basis of cognition and of cognitivity. And there is a definition from Di Paolo of cognitivity that a system is cognitive when its behavior is governed by the norms of the system's own continued existence and flourishing. So that is what we have been describing. This is what core cognition is all about. So continued existence is about surviving, coping, problem solving, and flourishing is about co-creating and pervasive optimization. And that is associated also with a measure of agentic success. So the more often you are in the co-creation mode, the more satisfied your needs are, the more you are thriving and the higher your cognitivity is. On the other hand, the more you are in the coping mode, you have more frequent unsatisfied needs and you're withering, and hence it is a sign of low cognitivity. Yeah, so the measure of success, of life success, is already encapsulated in this. So let's now go into another topic, closing the system. So let's look first at the difference between controlled and innate dynamics. So the left picture we have an electronic circuit board, and the right picture we have a so-called Kalman vortex street that emerges when, in this case, you float soap on water and have it meet an obstacle. And here is the obstacle. So down here, that's the obstacles. And behind the obstacle we have all kinds of forms, and the forms they are similar, but they are never completely the same. So here we have all kinds of regular structures that are static, they allow precise predictions, and many patterns are repeated. And here we have, well, irregular structures, although they are similar. They are dynamic, they are not well predictable, at least not very well. And every pattern is unique, while here many patterns are repeated. And this is kind of an ideal difference between controlled and innate dynamics. Another example is just this. This is a shaped environment here of a city versus something that was allowed to self-develop, nature, and with exactly the same properties. So more irregular structures, it's dynamic, it's less precisely predictable, and every pattern is unique. Although all kinds of things are more or less repeated, and we have structures that are repeated, but not in the way this is structured. It's a completely higher level of control over the situation. So let's go into, so let's start with a general system. A system that has innate dynamics and it has influences on it, and it exerts influences to the outside. The key of the definitional properties of a system is that it has stronger internal relations than external relations, and it has innate properties and dynamics that are characteristic. So we can go in two ways. We can control the environment and hence curtail the innate dynamics, or we can liberate it from limitations and therefore promote its innate properties and its innate dynamics. So, and we focus on the left, on controlling the environment. So let's close the system here, and we do that by imposing more and more conditions on what the system has as an input, and that leads to the closing of the system and more predictable dynamics, and with that a predictable output. So that leads then to a closed system defined by the conditions imposed on it. And who imposes the conditions on it? Well, that is the agency. That is what agents do. They do it to create their own environment of the cell and what makes them living, but they also can impose limitations and conditions on things in their environment. So closing a system is an act of agency, and they do that by controlling the environment of a system, and hence they ensure that the system can be approximated as isolated from the rest of reality, because whatever relationship they have with reality is under their control. And they do that to create a predictable or dependable utility, typically. So agents shape the world by closing systems around them or closing themselves, and therefore making the world more and more predictable. At least that is one strategy. So let's go to a highly controlled system as an example, the smartphone. So the smartphone is designed to let electrons do exactly what they need to do, and that corresponds to all kinds of behaviors that we then interpret as a useful function. So you press a number of buttons or places on the screen actually, and then some information is fetched from somewhere around the world, ferried back, presented in form that we understand, and this is all electrons moving, and in between a little bit of electromagnetic waves. But this whole process is completely under control, and that leads to a super special and dependable organization. That is actually, it's super unique that we are able to make this, and no single person can make this. This can only be made by many thousands of people working together, because no one is able to make an iPhone from scratch and first principles. That's way beyond our individual capability. So let's go into a number of properties of, in general, controlled systems. Well, like the smartphone, they have a predictable utility, and they originate from high-stake problem solving. That's the whole purpose of closing systems, and the coping mode in general, and therefore it works in familiar situations. We create a system for a particular situation, and that situation must be familiar, although it might be a problem. It is always a short-term view, so it's if this, then that. And that's the general thing of a closed system. And depending on the time scales of the system, it is always not more than this. We have created a system with a known and finite set of inputs, internal states, and outputs. And so it's all known and finite. Well, it's not completely finite, but it's well enough. And because we closed it from its environment, it is unaware of its environment. And going to the other side again, because it was originated in high-stake problem solving, it is about one solution, the solution that we take. And that solution, that can be realized when we ensure that the conditions on which the solution depends are true or false, and it must be true eventually. That is the power part. We have to make the conditions true, influence the environment. But it means that we have a class of situations in the world for which the conditions are true and another class for which the condition is false. So we have a binary classification. Either we are interested in either whether they are true or whether they are false, and whether they are false we want to make them true. And that also means that we are not so interested in what is the particular situation. We are only we want to know whether it is this class or that class, and we are insensitive to within class differences. We are actually only interested in categories of things, not individual things, and we are only interested in useful categories that help us make those conditions true or false. So this is already saying a lot about how our rationality works, and models of artificial intelligence have these components, and it's not for nothing that it's also part of an iPhone. But we can make this a little bit more complicated. We can have a system as part of a nested system, in which those systems collaborate with other systems in all kinds of convoluted ways, but there still is something of an input and a predictable system function and an output. And now you see that the order and structure is very important. So if you screw around within this system, then the system will not work anymore. And that has associated with syntax, with form. Another thing is that this system with its function has observable effects, and whoever is observing it, it will see something similar, and therefore we have a system of shareable objective meaning. Everyone kind of agrees on what this system is doing. And we have parts that lead to the whole, so it's constructed from the bottom up, and isolating the system itself also has a number of consequences. So we have a focus of attention that makes sense. So this system is actually part of a much bigger whole in which we focus on this part, and that means that we ignore or suppress other parts. And others are distractors, but some are kind of interfering with our ideal system function and our ideal focus of attention, and they don't contribute really to it. And the easiest way to deal with them is to deny them. And you have to deny those influences in some way to keep the system function. So it is very similar. If you have a bureaucracy and the bureaucracy works according to this form well filled in and then leads to that action, and then someone all of a sudden says, yes, but your sister, it's not on the form. So it doesn't matter what your sister. And so these are all kinds of influences that a bureaucracy has to deny, basically, because it doesn't help to contribute its function. We can make this even more complicated, and this is a picture of cellular processes, a so-called metabolic metro map. And this is how our cells, as the closed system, have a very similar structure of all kinds of relationships that lead to different functions. So a key function here, for example, is the citric acid cycle that is in energy production. And this is about carbon fixation and photorespiration, which plants do. So not every part is present in all cells, but in general, pretty much all metabolics of life are presented in this picture. So now we have a few more properties that I added to this picture. And these are properties that in general say a lot about how closed systems work. So how about opening a system? And I will talk about that later, but a little bit now. So opening a system is another process. It's changing an okay system into a better system. And that also is an act of agency. And it is an act of agency because agents then allow the system, either other agents or whatever, to discover its innate dynamics, also still embedded in the environment. So it is about releasing systems from imposed constraints, and so to allow full self-development. And this is the picture that you would then expect: full self-development given an environment. And so this is not an environment in which so much is living, but in all kinds of places where something can live, there is something. So the question now is, what is full self-development? Self-development has to do with how we deal with complexity. And there is a beautiful tessellation from Escher, it's called Liberation. And it is about a very structured situation here and a very lively situation here, and a transition between them. And I like to visualize this as somewhere in the middle we have an agent coping capacity. So the agent can deal with this level of complexity normally. But given the situation, this level might be a little bit too complex, which means that he wants to reduce the complexity of the environment by control measures, and that leads to a more static, abstract and predictable situation, and those control strategies. But similarly, the agent cannot be taxed fully, and then has space to explore. And that means that it goes for more dynamic approaches, participatory, being a member in the world, interacting with the world, and going for novelty. And that leads to the properties of the co-creation mode, in which you can explore the complexity of the world, finding new possibilities, or you can tend to the complexity of the world by caring for the world. And so this is still a very complicated place. So if everyone cares a little bit for everyone else, this is a place where everyone can deal with the complexity. It can also go in the other direction, in which the control is dominant, and then you try typically curtail your own diversity, or you can structure the diversity in others. Yeah, so you can comply to the structure imposed here, or you can propose the structure here. So there's different type of functions here, but they both are part of the co-creation mode. So let's combine this with the value field that we have. So now we have the values, and still here the agent coping capacity that I suggest should move from the left to the right. This is the main axis in this thing. This is the typical agentic developing thing, from dealing with problems to preventing problems. And now we have different interpretations of the different fields. So for example, this is now exploring complexity, and it is about finding possibilities. So you want to be independent, curious, you want to have freedom, creativity, choosing your own goals. So this makes perfect sense. Or you can tend complexity, care for the world, and then you're going for a world of peace, social justice, preserving the environment, unity with nature, love, beauty, equality, and harmony, those kind of things. Or here you can curtail the diversity of yourself, so ensure that you don't do stupid things, do only the things that are possible given the situation. So accept my portion in life, being obedient, respect for transitions, being moderate, family security, those kind of things. Or structuring the diversity in others via social power, wealth, being influential, or being an authority. or helping to do that by being successful in an organization that tries to do that. And so this is a different interpretation, but now an interpretation more associated with the defining features of life as we have defined them. So, last topic of today, the two half brains that we have. And they are intimately associated with what we just discovered and what we just talked about. And I base myself on an absolutely magnificent book by Iain McGilchrist, The Master and His Emisary. Iain McGilchrist is, he studied pretty much every field you can think of within medicine and the humanities. And he is able to integrate across all kinds of different fields of science, like I also try to do. And he made a book about how our divided brain shaped the course of historical development and how it actually made the key structures of our Western world. And the topic of hemispheric differences, so differences between the left and the right hemisphere, that has gotten out of fashion. Because we were originally only thinking that one half of the brain would do one thing and another half of the brain would do another thing. But it's not the functions that matter. What matters is how the both sides of the brain make sense of the world and how they relate to the world. And they do that in a complementary way. So they are always involved in everything, but sometimes one offers a better solution and sometimes the other offers a better solution. So the right hemisphere is the master, and it presents what exists, so it is in tune with the rest of the world. And the left hemisphere is the emissary, the servant, who solves problems, whatever is necessary, and he does that in a world of its own that is based on the presented world, but it is now a presented world, only a small part of that world, a closed small part of that world, and it's using that world for all kinds of purposes. So it represents the world's utility. Connected to the brain, it looks a bit like this. We have two half brains. They are weakly coupled, and they are kind of connected via the lower levels, say the brainstem and the limbic system. And the brainstem might decide on which part of the brain actually has the best solution at any point in time. Yeah, so they are not doing the same, but they are coming up with complementary and sometimes contradictory solutions. And but we have to make a decision, and we switch between the proposals of the left and the right hemisphere. That is kind of the idea. And how do they do that? Well, they have a function associated with structure and openness, with the tessellation of Escher. So we have a left hemisphere that is for cognition, for control, for order, for certainty, for utility, and we have a right cortical hemisphere that is for exploration, disorder, possibility, and engagement with the world. And that allows us to deal with both sides. And McGilchrist visualizes that in a different way. So he turns, by the way, the picture around, so left is now right, etc., because this is how we look at the brain of someone else. But on this side we have cognition for control, order, certainty, and utility. And this is the closed world cognition. So it's static, it's isolated, it's fixed, it's general in nature, it's decontextualized, it's abstracted, but very clear. And so this is, and eventually lifeless. So this is typically closed world cognition. This is open world cognition. This is one big mess of all kinds of social and other influences going together and influencing everything in the context of everything else and making sense of that. And he describes it as that the right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings in the context of the lived world. A closed system can be perfect because it is a closed and finite system, but it comes at the cost of emptiness. Its disconnectedness from the rest of the world leads to an empty perfection that does justice to the rest of the whole and the whole beauty of the whole. But it's very, very useful in many cases. In this paper, we summarized the differences that McGilchrist described for the left and the right hemisphere, and we did it in table 1 of this paper. And I will now go through the table. It's a little bit boring in some sense, but it's super interesting information. So let's go to the first page. In the first page, we have here the top, it's always the same, left hemisphere with cognition for control, order, certainty, utility. Right hemisphere, cognition for exploration, disorder, possibility, and engagement. And this is all kinds of different issues. So the main concern of the left is utility, and of the right is what actually is. The scope of the left is short and local, and of the right is broader and long-term. The left is interested in what is familiar and known, and what it knows, and man-made objects, so other closed things. And the right hemisphere is interested in novel, in what it experiences, in new information, new skills, engagement with other living individuals. So absolute opposites in interest, and we need both. Another page here, the strength of the left is typically that it's efficient in routine situations with familiar skills, and it generates expectations. Yes, the whole purpose. It makes the world more predictable and more usable. The right hemisphere is, on the other hand, good when prediction is difficult, when it's a big mess, when there are many options and no clear structure, and it's for that reason more efficient when initial assumptions need to be revised or when old information needs to be distinguished from new information. So, attention type, no, local, narrow, selective, broad, global, and flexible. Construction of the world, well, the left hemisphere starts by pieces, bottom up, and the right hemisphere starts from the whole, the whole of experience, and then go into detail if necessary. Another page, how objects are represented. The left represents categories of things, while the right presents or represents in unique instances of things. So this is interested in girls versus boys, and this is interested in individuals, uniqueness, individuality. The problem-solving limitations, this is typically a single solution and latch onto that. Guys, we have a problem, let's solve it now. It denies inconsistencies. So the sister in the bureaucracy has no place in the form, so therefore it doesn't work. And it suppresses not currently relevant relations. Why? Because it created its own little world. On the right hemisphere, it's always open, and it's always open to alternatives, and always watching for discrepancies. So everything that is not fitting in the nice left model of the world is something that is where the right hemisphere is sensitive to. Preferred knowledge type, well, typically public knowledge. Everything that can be transmitted via language is something for the left hemisphere, while the right hemisphere is everything that you can learn from personal interaction with the world. It's a completely different type of knowledge. This is much more tacit knowledge, this is explicit knowledge. Then reasoning. Well, the left hemisphere is linear sequential reasoning, and concentrating helps to focus on the explicit structure of the problem. But the right hemisphere does it differently. So sometimes you need not to concentrate. So typically when you get your best ideas when you're under the shower or on a bike or something like that, that is the right hemisphere, allowing then you to bring a good idea into the focus of attention. And it typically works by aha phenomenon, which is that all of a sudden, whoop, things make more sense. So they connect together, they form a nice consistent pattern. and that is not the linear step. That is a whole complex pattern thing, going from one state to another. And the more you concentrate, the less the right hemisphere actually works. Well, language use, the left hemisphere is very good in symbol manipulation, but also not very good in deep meaning. The right hemisphere goes for deep meaning. It understands sarcasm and the different intonations and feelings in language much better. It's also for poetry. Last page here, the emotions associated with the left hemisphere are with competition, with rivalry, with individual self-belief, while the emotions of the right hemisphere are all emotions and emotions related to bonding and empathy. Typically, the last thing is that the left hemisphere, because it is not really concerned with individuals and it is concerned with a solution and getting a solution, whatever that means, it is unconcerned with others and their feelings, while the right hemisphere, having the luxury of not being for problematic situations, can have empathetic identification, more self-awareness, empathy, identification with others, and theory of mind of others. Yeah, so there is a completely different world, two different worlds in our brain, in the two halves of our brain. And the two halves, they offer benefits. And they offer benefits not only to each of us, but they also offer benefits to society. And so if you become proficient in seeing the effects of the different modes in society, you learn a lot about society, and you can say something about what types of behaviors or developments in society are governed by the left mindset or the right mindset. Yeah, so that is an important thing. But the main thing is that the organization of the brain reflects the requirements of agency and life. Yeah, so our brain is the way it is because life demands it to be. It has two different ways of interacting with the world, and that is the reason why our brain is reflecting its current structures and functions and outlooks. All right, let's go to the summary of today. The example was hemispheric differences. Sustainability was addressed via needful freedom, because if you look at how we deal with energy and material throughput and how we select our behavior to deal that in order to remain ourselves alive, that is actually a definition of sustainability. The development of our thoughts was about the development of our coping capacity. So that was the tessellation of Escher with the coping capacity developing. This is thinking was associated with closed and open systems thinking. Feelings, we hardly address the feelings, but closed systems lead to closed feelings. So the more you abstract away, the less you actually have feelings, and so the feelings are much more in the right hemispheric domain, but there are some feelings associated with being unable to create your closed systems, and those have to do with competition, with irritation, and some others. The oppositions were structured versus a complex world. The quadrant was the core effect quadrant in its new form, or current form, which is associated with the definitions of life. We were closing the system, and the main concepts were left and right hemisphere, needful freedom, cognitivity, innate dynamics, and what understanding actually is. The references of today, and then I hope to see you all at the next session, How Life Shaped the Biosphere.